University of Washington Bothell presents Research in Action. See how UW Bothell faculty apply their academic interests and pursuits to real-life problems, combining research and practice to better serve the greater community.
I'm a professor in the education program. I've been with the education program since its inception, the very first day. And my most recent research interests are in social mobility through schooling. I'm very interested in the processes by which some kids whose parents do not go to college become successful in school and then go through the pretty complicated journey of moving on to college and then beyond and moving into new social worlds, the intellectual changes, the personal changes, the cultural changes that happen through schooling beyond just what is learned. So I had sabbatical 3 years ago now, and one of my projects during that sabbatical was to travel down to Berkeley to the Center for Digital Storytelling to do a week-long production workshop, and then I went from that into the Train the Trainers program. I've been very interested in projects by which people whose voices normally aren't in policy debates or normally aren't part of public debates about issues that affect one's own life, how to bring more voices into that. And I'm very interested in digital media and the potential to bring more voices into the conversation. And so I heard about digital storytelling, which involves writing, which involves the use of visual images, sound, some musical soundtracks under it, and how all those together could convey ideas and to convey one's knowledge of oneself or one's circumstances to a broader public audience. So after that initial training, I came back, and the first summer I was back, I taught a course here for our graduate students in the education program who are teachers. That course was Telling Our Stories as Teachers. There are lots of untold stories of teaching these days in a very vibrant policy environment. And I love teaching the course, and I think it was very successful. The next year, Andreas Brockhaus and I put together a proposal to do a faculty institute in digital storytelling. We wanted more faculty to explore the possibilities of using multimedia projects in their courses. It was funded through the Vice Chancellor's office. We had 17 faculty and staff participating in a 3-day production workshop. And then after that initial 3 days of very intensive work where everyone created their own digital story, we formed teaching circles, and then people formed cross-programmatic conversations in which they explored how this might play out in their classrooms, how they might use multimedia in their coursework. And some very nice projects came out of that in IAS and in nursing and education. Anthony Smith in the educational program. Anthony Smith has been, he teaches our literacy courses, and he has been really exploring how literacy is a changing field now. It's not just reading and writing text, but it's also being literate about media, writing for media, and not just for paper and pencil. So he and I together in our teacher certification program, where we're preparing pre-service teachers, have the students produce a digital story about themselves developing as literate people, whether they're reading or a writing experience. So they have an experience of creating a multimedia project, reflecting on themselves as readers and writers, as an example of things that they can also take to their classroom as a project that students can do. This summer there was a senior seminar taught by Kari Laram about, she really had a focus on storytelling as a means of social change, about conveying important social issues through the medium of story. And I worked a little bit with those students, but she had them working over the summer and picking a social issue and creating story around it. So those are two examples. The DREAM project ties very nicely into my issues and my questions about social mobility. The DREAM project started on the Seattle campus, I think now 4 years ago. And a little over a year now, the faculty advisor for that project came to the Bothell campus, did a presentation with some of the students, and asked if anyone here was interested in launching here, and I jumped on it. The DREAM project is student-led, student-initiated, student-to-student project by which college students go into high schools, area high schools, partner with the high schools, and work with low-income first-generation high school students through the college application process. Starting in the spring of junior year of a high school, we work with the students on college selection, on beginning to craft solid applications, on beginning to think about themselves as college students, and then we stay with those students through their senior year of college, through the application process, through the process of applying for financial aid, through weighing acceptances, and then making that transition to college, which is a very big step for students for whom this is a very new experience. So it's a wonderful program in that it develops excellent leadership in the college students. It makes them much more conscious of their own journey going to college and the meaning of that for them. It is a incredible resource for the high school students who otherwise wouldn't have this much attention. They're often from families who don't have the resources to say, here's how you select colleges, here's how you write a really strong application essay. And often they go to high schools where there aren't really rich resources to support those things. And then our hope, too, and we're just in our second year now, is that those students then will come to UWB, find themselves amongst a community of people they already know. They'll join the DREAM project, and then will also turn back to their own high schools and be supportive of the next group of students coming through. I run a 2-credit class each quarter in which we talk about issues of college access. We talk about issues of mobility and the complications of mobility. We talk about how it's becoming much more competitive to get into college these days and how it is that we can best support students' application process. And we talk about justice issues, fair access to college for all kids who are qualified and want to go. It's a really rich experience. We started with 12 students last fall in our first quarter. I just checked the enrollment figures. We have 37 students signed up for this fall, and we're expecting more. I know some of our returning students haven't registered yet. I think we'll have 40 to 45. We've grown pretty rapidly. We're currently in 3 area high schools. We're in Mariner High School, we are in Bothell High School, and we're in Juanita High School. All of these schools have numbers of students who are recent immigrants. The populations of the schools have changed relatively rapidly, and the school staff is still catching up to the needs of these students. So they've very strongly welcomed us to bring in enthusiastic college students who will work one-on-one weekly with these students to get them ready to apply to college. We have people from all majors. We have freshmen through seniors. We have freshmen assuming leadership positions and seniors pretty much investing in it for the mentoring. So I think it's a fabulous opportunity for the freshmen to connect to a very tight community here as soon as they get here that they'll be part of all the way through. And it's a chance for seniors to exercise leadership that they might not otherwise have had an opportunity to. We have very busy students here, and that the fact that they can get academic credit for this and count this towards a minor in education, I think it's a way for them to serve the community in ways that otherwise wasn't available to them here. I'm really seeing all of these things coming together. I really see being able to do some scholarly research on the effectiveness of the DREAM program, not just for the students who are coming up through the high schools and how effective are we in ushering those students into college, but I'm very interested in the effects of the DREAM project on the UWB students. How does it make them more aware of their own educational journey and more conscious of what they actually have accomplished? The leadership potential. I'm very interested in possibly how our students are experiencing the DREAM project differently than the Seattle campus students. I know our students, we have single parents, we have students who are working full-time nights, going to school full-time days. They're fitting this in to these very complicated lives. And what does that mean for a model like this where it relies so heavily on student leadership? I think we have things to say about that here at Bothell and how you develop leadership with students who are in very busy lives. I'm very interested in doing more multimedia work with those students so that they perhaps could develop their stories of how they got to college in a very powerful little multimedia project and share that with their mentees and with the people in their high schools. So there's writing to be done, there's multimedia work to be done. So I'm seeing all of those come together in the next couple of years.
First off, you should know that Washington State has some of the cleanest air in the United States. That's good. We do get the air off the Pacific Ocean, which is relatively clean. So most of the time, these pollutants are pretty well scrubbed out of the air over the Pacific, but not every day. Some days there'll be, if you will, depending on what the weather patterns, there'll be wafts of this pollution that we can detect coming in from Asia. And on a few days a year, maybe 5 days a year, we will get a significant slug of this pollution that comes in from Asia and can contribute to our own air pollution. And the way I think of this is we have our own air pollution, and then this air pollution comes in and adds to that. And what we breathe is the sum of all of that pollution. Now, at the same time, over the last 20 years, something that's been happening in the United States as a result of rules from the Environmental Protection Agency is our air quality standards have gotten tighter and tighter and tighter. Scientific information has shown that air pollutants affect your health, especially elderly and babies, but everybody, at lower and lower concentrations. And so EPA has been lowering the standards, making them tougher and tougher and tougher. And what that means is now, as we lower the standards, we have to be concerned not only with our own local pollution, but also with pollution that comes in from other places. So there's been a huge amount of interest in this, and not just for Washington, but also how does what we call this background air, it's the air that comes into all of the United States, and as that air gets a little bit dirtier, remember it's clean already, but as it gets a little bit dirtier, it makes it harder for Cleveland to meet their air quality standards. It makes it harder for Los Angeles to meet their air quality standards. And so whether we're talking about ozone or particulate matter or mercury or persistent organics like pesticides, all of these things we've now detected in the air coming out of the Pacific from Asia. And the critical piece of information is how much is coming in from these sources compared to how much is our own and where the standards are. We had some hunches that pollution could get transported long distances. Some other scientists working actually out of Africa had used satellite information to show that pollutants could get transported thousands of kilometers. And one of the things that we noticed, of course, was that our upstream neighbors in Asia were starting to really rapidly develop and grow. And so I asked the question, was there any possibility that we could see these pollutants coming all the way over to the United States? And as a scientist does, we develop a hypothesis and we design an experiment and we think about how we could test that hypothesis. We went out to what we thought would be one of the cleanest places in the Northern Hemisphere, out on the tip of Washington State, where the air comes in off the Pacific Ocean, to see if we could detect any traces of these pollutants coming in from Asia. Make a long story short, we did. We detected those pollutants. We were able to detect pollutants coming from industry, things like carbon monoxide and ozone and aerosols. And that got people's interest and attention. That work was very widely covered, and it really woke people up to the possibility that pollution could get transported thousands of kilometers. One of the biggest concerns is that we know that Asia has been the most rapidly growing economies in the world. Especially China has been growing 8 to 10% for the last 10 years. Enormously rapid growth going on in those countries. Now, they're not doing anything we didn't do. They're developing along the same lines with industry and electricity and cars that we did. But there's over 1 billion people in China. So as they do this and as they develop very rapidly, we now know that their emissions from their industries and their cars are increasing very rapidly, on the order of 10% a year. Well, at 10% a year, that means you double the amount of emissions in only about 7 years. So in just a 7-year period, the amount of pollution coming out of China is doubling. So there's a very strong ramp up to this, and so our expectation is that the amount of this pollution that's coming in from other countries, especially China, is going to double every 7 years. That's a real concern. So now we have to think about how can we engage our international partners in agreements so that we can say, okay, maybe this isn't in everyone's best interest. Of course, remember, they also have very bad air quality in many of these Chinese cities, and so you'd like to think about some way to partner so that we can make a win-win out of it, while at the same time they are still going to develop. So there's a very strong international component to this. Well, we started out at this site out in the tip of Washington State, a place called Chica Peak, which is a little hill out right on the coast of Washington. It's a beautiful place out on the Makah Reservation out near Neah Bay. We go out there, we bring a lot of different sophisticated instruments. We have to test the instruments in the lab. We do calibrations on the instrument. So we're constantly testing this instrument to making sure our data is really good. Then we bring the instruments out in the field and we connect them to computers or different kinds of data loggers, and we let them run for weeks at a time. All that time we're collecting the data. And then we'll use meteorological data, winds, we'll use weather models, we'll use satellite data to try to put the whole story together. Now, it's not just me. There's a lot of students involved in this. I have undergraduates and graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, all of which are doing different parts of, and what we ultimately do is we try to put that story together so that the different pieces come together and we're telling the whole story. I would say about 3/4 of the measurements we do are off-the-shelf instruments, and about 1/4 where we have to really develop the analytical methodologies ourselves. Right now, for example, we have an instrument to measure mercury for an aircraft. As far as I know, it's the only one in the world. It's to measure the various details on the chemical forms of mercury. We're still in the testing stages of that instrument, but it's looking very promising, looking like it works quite well. We're hoping to use that on a major national mercury experiment in 2011. This work absolutely requires a team. I can't do it all myself. In my group, we publish, 6 or 7 or 8 papers, publications a year, and I'm the first author on maybe 2 or 3 of those, and my students are publishing great studies on this work. I help them, hopefully. But we have graduate students who are getting their PhDs, often in atmospheric sciences or in chemistry. I have undergraduates. I have UW-Bothell undergraduates who have been majoring in our environmental science program. And these students are doing everything from testing instruments in the lab, taking the instruments out to our field site, sometimes flying in the airplane, sometimes climbing up onto the towers on Mount Bachelor to fix sensors. That's the fun part. And then we get the data, then we have to figure out what it means. That's the really fun part, because sometimes when you have a data set that you've spent a lot of time and made sure it's a really good data set, and then you dig into that data set and you discover something from that, you're the first one in the world to discover that. It's a very, very exciting feeling. It's a very powerful feeling. You know something that no one else in the world knows. And then you publish it and you tell the world about it, and that's kind of the fun and excitement of doing science. So let's see, graduate students, we have undergraduates, I have a full-time technician, we have postdoctoral fellows as well. So typically my research team is anywhere from 6 to 8 people with a mix of those types of students involved. Most of our funding has come from federal agencies. When we first started, this was, if you will, curiosity-driven research. Nobody thought about the implications of it, and we just wanted to see if we could detect this. So this was really supported initially by the National Science Foundation. And I should say the National Science Foundation has been a very steady funder for us, and we've been able to successfully compete for funding through writing proposals with the National Science Foundation. In the last 5 years, or last 7 years, though, EPA, NOAA, and NASA have also been funding us, partly because they're what we call the mission agencies. They have a specific interest in a particular problem in the environment. Obviously, EPA's goal, protecting the environment for the United States, and they've been very interested in this problem to understand how much pollution comes from somewhere else to add to our own local loading of pollution. NOAA is interested because of the climate implications. It turns out that there's a lot of interaction between what we study and climate, because dust and particulate matter has a very strong climate impact. Ozone is a climate gas. And again, because of this rapid development going on in Asia, we know that they are becoming one of the largest contributors to the greenhouse problem as well. NASA is interested because of the connections with seeing things from satellites in space. We use a lot of different satellite data. So we've been funded by all of these agencies, and fortunately we've been pretty successful in getting funding for this, which has allowed me to support the graduate students, undergraduates, and technicians and all this. It's very expensive work, I should say. And I think I added up, we've brought in about $4 or $5 million over the last 10 years of funding to support all of this. One of the things we saw early on was that a lot of times, or we had a hunch, I should say, that the pollutants a lot of times would go over our heads, higher elevation in the atmosphere. So in 1999, we started out by using a small aircraft that we were able to use as part of the National Science Foundation pool of aircraft. And we did an experiment, we called it PHOBIA, had a great acronym, stood for Photochemical Ozone Budget of the Eastern North Pacific Atmosphere. And we were able to get funding from the National Science Foundation for that work with the aircraft. And we flew that aircraft, again, right off the coast of Washington, where we expect to have very clean air, except maybe when the winds are blowing these pollution across the Pacific Ocean, then we would expect to see traces of pollution coming out of Asia. And we did those flights. We did about a dozen flights where we flew the aircraft from sea level all the way up to about 30,000 feet. And sure enough, we detected pollution coming out of Asia probably on 5 or 6 of those flights. So it's not every day, but it's episodic, and it depends on what the winds are doing and what the weather patterns are doing. And again, we found these same traces of these pollutants, of things that are from gases and aerosol particulate matter from industry and from vehicles and from desert dust and from a whole mix of sources. And one of the things we try to do is to sort out how much different sources contribute on different days. So we used the National Science Foundation aircraft in 1999. But because we were able to identify these pollutants coming in higher elevation, I wanted to find an aircraft that we could use that would be available locally and that would be cheaper to operate. And so starting in 2001, we made contact with a flight school up in Everett called Northway Aviation. And we were able to make a deal with the flight school to rent their plane with their instructor pilots. That was good. I didn't want to fly the plane. And they allowed us to make some modifications to the plane so that we could put our instrumentation on that plane, and we were able to use those planes at relatively low cost to do these flights where we flew from sea level up to about 20,000 feet. And we've used those planes, the plane from Northway Aviation, probably on 50 days, which is a lot. That's a lot of data to get at relatively inexpensive cost compared to the National Science Foundation plane. And we've used that plane in 2001, 2002, 3, 5, and then 2006, and also 2008. So we've really made great use of that local plane. And in the process, we've also partnered with our community, and I think this is National Science Foundation dollars that ultimately get distributed around the community. So that's one of the advantages of this kind of work as well. Then starting in 2004, we said, well, look, we really would like to be able to, at a high elevation, to be able to measure this pollutants all the time. A lot of people are interested in it. EPA was calling me up and asking me about mercury, which is something I didn't know very much about at the time. And we started getting into the mercury research as well as wanting to do continuous measurements. So I hunted around for a mountaintop site. And we made a few false starts there in the beginning, but eventually settled on a mountain in Oregon called Mount Bachelor. You've probably heard about it. It's a ski area. It's at 9,000 feet at the top, and made contacts with the ski area and asked them if we could start to use their summit station to put some instruments in. They said yes. We got our foot in the door. Initially, we had just a couple of small boxes. But eventually, we have a lot of instruments there now, and we have a continuous suite of instruments measuring carbon monoxide, ozone, aerosols, mercury, radon, weather. So we have a whole bunch of information that's being generated, and that information is coming downloaded every hour to our website, which is part of the UW-Bothell website. And we're able to look at any given time, we can look and see what the pollution levels are at 9,000 feet. And based on a lot of different kinds of information, satellite information, weather data, we can gauge how much of that pollution is coming from different source regions. Well, first I would say, first thing we've learned, mercury is very complex. It's probably the most complex of the pollutants that we study. It's emitted by industry, but it's also emitted by nature. It gets into the ecosystem, but it doesn't stay there. It can be re-emitted. So sorting out how much mercury is being emitted today versus how much is due to emissions from 50 years ago is a very complex problem. We don't understand the chemical forms of mercury. There's a whole lot of uncertainty around what we're trying to study, and hopefully we can make some progress on that so that we can reduce the uncertainty and better understand the policy implications. First, you should know that there is a local component to mercury and there's a global component. If you have a large local source of mercury, like a power plant or perhaps a cement factory, that can contribute to what we call mercury deposition. Mercury in the rain and deposited to the surface of the earth regionally, maybe within a region of 100 kilometers, 50 miles around a power plant. But on top of that, there's a global contribution. And that global contribution is really contribution from everybody's sources around the world. Well, again, it turns out that using coal in Asia is a very large contributor to that global pool of mercury. So we've both detected that mercury as it's traveled out of China to the Pacific and all the way over to Washington State, but then it mixes into this global pool and ultimately, if you will, rains down more or less uniformly throughout the earth, all over the earth. Well, dust is another word we use for particulate matter. And particulate matter has very clear health impacts. When you breathe it in at high concentration, there are health impacts from asthma all the way up to different kinds of cardiorespiratory effects on the body. EPA has standards for particulate matter, and so dust is one of those components in there. What we've found is that, especially in springtime, there is pretty much a persistent low-level dust coming out of deserts and from pollution in Asia. Now again, what that does is it adds to the burden of pollutants, and then we add our own pollution to that. So it's the sum of those two that we are ultimately breathing in. And what we found is there can be actually quite a bit of what we call interannual variability, variability from one year to the next. We can have a high dust year over the Gobi Desert, which means we get a lot of that dust over here in the western United States. We can have a low dust year over the Gobi Desert and not so much coming over to the United States. And in a high year, though, we will get as much as 20 or 30% of the EPA standard coming over. So if your standard is this much, this is the allowable level where you have health effects here, you're already taking up a third of it by someone else's dust coming in and blowing in on the wind. So that has a very important policy implication. Well, probably for me, the most important thing to do in science teaching is to convey the enthusiasm of generating original results. Science isn't about memorizing data or formulas or numbers. It's really about a method, and it's about asking questions, developing hypotheses, coming up with an experiment, and going and do that experiment. And I think one of the most exciting and fun parts of being a scientist is that aha moment when you really do know something that no one else in the world knows. Now when you go out there, you have to convince other scientists that you know it and that you're correct, and that can be challenging sometimes, a process we call peer review. But I think if I can convey that in my teaching, I think like I've succeeded. Now that said, students have to learn the rules of chemistry and the Avogadro's number and the equilibrium constants to get to that point where they can design experiments and really do good science. So I like to think that I'm able to help convey some of that enthusiasm of being a scientist. It's a really fun job. I would say that to anybody who asked me. Well, we have a great future of science at UW-Bothell. We have several very interdisciplinary majors already here in environmental science, environmental studies. We're in the process of just started a new science and technology program, which I'm one of the first faculty members in. We're developing a climate science degree. We're developing a lot of new initiatives in science. The legislature has funded the first step in our new science building, so within a few years there's going to be a new science building here on campus. And our administration has clearly made science a very high priority. So I think we have a great future here, and I look forward to seeing lots of science students here.
My name's Mary Baroni, and I'm the director of the nursing program at the University of Washington-Bothell, and I've been at Bothell for about 8 years, going into my 8th year. The role of research in nursing as an applied discipline fits very nicely into the UW-Bothell context. As a campus that's very committed to interdisciplinary work. In the nursing program, we use the Boyer model that was originally published in the early 90s. Ernest Boyer talked about expanding the notion of research to go beyond what we typically think about research as discovering new knowledge, generating new knowledge. And while that's very important and it is one component of the way we look at research, the Boyer model also talks about the scholarship of teaching, the scholarship of application, which in our situation as an applied discipline has to do with practice and service, and also the scholarship of integration, which in my mind is probably the most complex because the scholarship of integration builds on that discovery, the traditional notion of scholarship, and allows us to translate that new knowledge to either other disciplines or to the community so that it can be used. We engage our students in the nursing program with faculty research in very real-world ways. Again, using the Boyer model, many of the faculty in the nursing program are engaged with community partnerships, whether it be work with diabetes with the Tulalip tribe, working with addictions research in the community, working on public health policies in the community. And there are a number of ways that our students become involved. A couple examples. In our master's program, they do projects in their final year. A couple of years ago, one student, Ellen Noel, actually was a PI of a study, a randomized control study in her workplace with 2 surgeons as co-PIs. And what they did is they wanted to explore patient-paced progression in diet post elective abdominal surgery versus the typical approach of waiting until there are certain physiological signs and waiting for the physician to visit. And that study is actually still going on now. Another example, which is in the applied research realm, our students are all working nurses, and so sometimes having them involve themselves in the scholarship of teaching with us can be a challenge with their busy lives. A few years ago, we revised our curriculum, and in one of our classes on program development evaluation, we actually asked a group of the students to serve as our consultants, and they reviewed our curricular revision. That was within the context of that particular class, but what was another example of the scholarship of teaching is that 6 of the students and 3 of the faculty attended the Western Institute for Nursing Research Conference this past spring and presented their work. In fact, one of the students received an award for her poster presentation. We've been incredibly fortunate at the University of Washington Bothell nursing program to have federal support in fiscal year 2008 and 2009 to help us primarily focus on the nursing faculty shortage. One of the benefits that we have and the nature of the program here at Bothell is our undergraduate program is an RN to BSN completion program. For students who have graduated from the community college. As a result, we have very close partnerships with regional community colleges. With the federal funding, we were able to formalize this relationship and create a consortium of nursing faculty, and with a primary focus of recruiting and retaining the next generation of nursing faculty. With this funding, we now have a consortium of 14 schools, including the University of Washington Bothell. We were able to give out over $260,000 over the past 2 years of scholarship funds for master's students who are interested in nursing education and faculty roles and are willing to teach at one of our partner schools at least part-time during their program. What this allows us to do is mentor them into the faculty role while they complete their master's degree. In addition, we've been holding a number of consortium workshops with faculty from each of the 14 schools. Last March, we had our first one, and we had over 100 faculty from 14 schools spend a day together thinking about the challenges and opportunities in recruiting and retaining the next generation of nursing faculty. I'm not sure there's been another type of workshop or consortium that's had that many faculty from that many schools working together for a day. With the federal funding that we've been able to receive, we were able to not only give out significant scholarship assistance to students entering who wanted to enter or develop their faculty roles upon completion, we were also able to double the enrollment of our master's program with this funding. I'd like to share a few thoughts that I have after being at the University of Washington Bothell for the last 7 years about the impact that external funding and community partnerships have on this campus and for nursing in particular. Our federal funding that we've received to support developing the next generation of nursing faculty is one example of that. As we were developing our community partnerships, whether it be with the community colleges, whether it be with our practice partners, our philosophy about external funding is that once you've had those partnerships established, then you can be much more effective and very genuine in seeking grant support. To start with the external funding as the driver, I think is less effective. And we're very pleased to be able to be very competitive now with funding, whether at the federal level, at the state level, or from foundations, and be recognized for the very genuine collaboration and interdisciplinary work that we're doing. And that really, I believe, is the key to the future funding in an applied discipline such as nursing. I don't think there's a person that isn't aware of the nursing shortage, whether it's at the bedside or in the classroom. And this is something that's been a challenge for us over the past 5 or 6 years, even longer, and expect it will continue. But one of the silver linings of this shortage is it has brought practice of nursing, the education of nursing, and the research related to nursing together in partnership in a way that we were drifting apart, I believe, 15, 20 years ago. And so I see the future of research in a discipline that needs to remember always that we're really about practice, and that whatever role we may be playing, it all is about bringing that back to the practice level to improve the health care of people that we serve. I believe that we will see more research between practice agencies and the university, between industry and the university, and I think that helps us really genuinely realize that Boyer vision that research just to generate knowledge, if it just stays on a shelf, is necessary but insufficient.
I'm in the Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences program, and I've been there since 1993. The focus of my scholarship and research really has two aspects. One is I focus on human rights, which is an emerging field or discipline. It isn't yet a formal discipline. And so the scholarship is about exploring it as a discipline. The second element is the form that my scholarship takes. It's a form of public scholarship in which I'm out in the community as much as I can be, talking about these issues and finding out from the community how they're acting or reacting to a variety of social justice, human rights issues that emerge around the world. The other thing about this particular field of work is that it is constantly changing. It is really a current events kind of scholarship, so one has to pay attention all the time to what's happening in international relations and also in domestic relations, because human rights applies locally as well as internationally. And we want to get citizens, namely students, to start to understand the breadth and complexity of the concept and the movement of human rights around the world. The public scholarship part of it, the format that my scholarship takes as opposed to the traditional academic formats, is to try and bridge the gap between the academic community and the general public. Education shouldn't stop when you leave school. It should continue in a variety of formats and ways. So I speak to government agencies, to church groups, to film festivals, in a lot of different venues where we're trying to get people to see a little bit better what this idea of human rights can do in terms of promoting social justice around the world. Human rights is a sticky concept, and in some ways it's new, and so it has multiple ways of looking at what that concept really means. But for example, if we were to contrast it with civil rights are those rights that a person has by virtue of the Constitution under which they live. It comes out of those political documents. Human rights don't come out of that. They come out of the fact that you're a human being. And essentially an agreement among virtually every society and culture in the world of what the minimum requirements are for that human to live a life of dignity. So human rights don't stem from constitutions. In fact, they sort of, we would argue, transcend constitutions and trump constitutions. Now, there's plenty of overlap. So, the right of free expression can be found in most constitutions throughout the world. So things like that are definitely shared with the civil rights tradition. But other kinds of rights that are based upon the notion of dignity, that people should have adequate food, water, clothing, and shelter, for example, you do not always find in the constitutions around the world. And human rights asks those broader and larger questions about dignity and equality rather than just freedom and rights with respect to the government. The Human Rights Education and Research Network was started in 1998. I had been sort of given the classes to teach in human rights beginning in 1996, and realized I had a lot of work to do to understand this concept myself, as well as to be able to go into the classroom and teach it effectively to students. So I looked around for models of how I could get help in doing so, and found a model in Moscow. Eastern Europe is my sort of area of expertise in a way. And so I traveled to Moscow and I studied the Moscow Research Center on Human Rights and looked at how they were operating and what they did. When I came back to Bothell, I decided that I had to try and build something like that here on the campus in order to reach out to a broader range of people. In fact, I decided we needed to go to all three campuses and tap into the fantastic scholarship that's going on in Seattle as well as Tacoma. So I was really fortunate. I wrote a grant that happened to coincide with a provost initiative to innovate in fields all across the university. So we were given a $280,000 grant to set up the Human Rights Education and Research Network. And we connected all three campuses of the university, faculty, staff, and students. We put on conferences. We built brand new curricula at all three campuses. When we first started, there were only the three human rights classes here at the University of Washington, Bothell. But by the time we finished, there were 14 immediately, but now over 30-some courses throughout the university specifically labeled human rights, not to mention the dozens and dozens of other courses that are related to social justice issues. So the network continued to do its work. We put on conferences, brought in speakers, do all the kinds of things that they do. It came to a technical conclusion in 2007, but we've now just received Senate Bill 5172 was passed and signed by the governor to create the University of Washington Center for Human Rights, which is the next iteration, the next step in this process of creating human rights presence on the campuses of the University of Washington. And that is just starting. We're having our first steering committee meetings this summer. And organizing ourselves, and of course going out and looking for some money, because that old money is no longer available as it used to be, as we all know. So we need to find funds and get going in transforming curricula, in supporting scholarship, supporting students and graduate students in this work, because that's really the most important thing. We have to build the next generation of human rights activists, scholars, advocates, thinkers, and people who know what they're doing in this particular arena. So we really, all of us, the faculty who are engaged in this, take this very seriously, that we have to think intergenerationally. We have to think across generations and not just concentrate on what we're doing here and now. So the Human Rights Education and Research Network was, I think, a quite successful endeavor to spread the word and build credibility in the larger communities around human rights. And now, thankfully, we have a Human Rights Center to take over. Human rights is an emerging field, and it is always changing. It's not the kind of list that some people make it out to be, but rather it's a changing set of questions that we ask about dignity in the world. Some of the frontiers now that we're looking at in particular are the frontiers of how do you make human rights work in particular cultures? How does it get translated into those cultures without necessarily letting the culture always trump? In fact, not at all. Human rights will say that they transcend cultures and sort of trump cultures, but at the same time we realize that we have to work with them. The other frontiers are what's called progressive realization, for example, where we're not sure exactly how to move all the time in achieving, let's say, universal education in the poorer countries around the world. How does one go about that as a process without making excuses for why all children aren't being educated properly. How do we move with realistic economies, with realistic political structures? So those implementation issues are really a frontier. One other area where the human rights idea is changing is we now have an international criminal court, which is a permanent court at the global level that can try cases of human rights infractions. So the legal machinery to enforce human rights is getting stronger and stronger. Another area, technology. The whole arrival of these new technologies, handheld and computer technologies and visual technologies that weren't available 50 years ago or 60 years ago when human rights came into being, at least the modern form of it. All these technologies now pose different kinds of issues and barriers and challenges and opportunities for people in the human rights field. Questions of privacy, questions of documentation, new questions of forensic science and how that is going to interact with cases of disappearances, let's say. So human rights must keep up with the changing world, must continually adapt to the issues that the world is confronting, and still keep in mind and keep at the forefront of our thinking, how do we preserve and enhance the dignity of human beings in the lives they're trying to lead. The question of how do we come to agree upon what are the human rights that we have is a fascinating story, actually, and in part it begins with Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the chair of the first Human Rights Commission that wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Her work to do just that, to bring scholars and thinkers and activists and advocates from around the world to the table and have a long, it's sometimes contentious and not always easy conversation about what are the minimum requirements of human dignity. And she did a magnificent job, and I think has never been given the full credit she deserves for this enormous amount of work it took to bring these different factions. The West, the developing world, the Soviet world at the time, all of these various cultures, various religions, all of them had to be brought together and a document had to be forged, which she ultimately called the Magna Carta for mankind. Because it was a magnificent sort of breakthrough in thinking about what are the global universal norms that people need to be held accountable to. Then the battles for creating actual treaties and binding law set in, and some of those are long struggles. The Genocide Convention, for example, it took the United States 40 years to sign the Genocide Convention. Long internal debates. So it's not an easy or smooth process. But I would say this, it's a democratic process. It's a process that must happen by consensus because you are really trying to get agreement of all people in the world. You could imagine a committee of 6 billion. If you just think about how the university works sometimes, committees of 3 don't work all that well. But so it is that. The form that this discussion is taking is itself respecting the human rights of all people around the world. Doesn't mean that everyone gets what they want, and it isn't necessarily written the way everyone would like. But there is a general consensus, and we're, in the human rights community, have been very proud of the way that human rights instruments are constructed. When I started at Bothell in 1993, there was a faculty member here, Professor Robert Schultz. And Professor Schultz had come from the University of Denver, where he had created a course that, through various evolutionary stages, ended up taking groups of students to D.C. to talk to, at that time, they were talking about Cold War issues and disarmament, to talk to the Pentagon, State Department, et cetera. When Professor Schultz came to the University of Washington Bothell, in 1990, he transformed that course into the Human Rights, the Washington, D.C. Human Rights Seminar. and started teaching it in that fashion and taking students back to DC every September and sometimes twice a year. When I started taking over the human rights courses, I also took over this course, and I have loved it. It's probably my favorite course of all the courses that I've taught. I take about 25 students with a TA back to Washington, D.C. We go through, after reading and work over the summer, we do an intensive week of briefings in D.C. We're going 8 in the morning till 10 at night usually. We go to Pentagon, State Department, embassies. We go to think tanks. We go to Capitol Hill. We talk to Congress people, senators. We go to Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. I mean, the list just goes on. And we talk to small groups as well as large groups, official groups and unofficial groups. And then we always, at the end of the evening, end of the day, we sit down for 2 hours and we debrief what we've been seeing and thinking about and doing that day. It's exhausting. Washington, D.C. can be quite warm in September. And we are dashing from meeting to meeting, sometimes 4, 5, 6 different briefings a day. So it leaves students bone tired at the end of the week, but transformed, because they really get to look behind the scenes of how policy is actually made. And that means the metaphor they use in D.C. is watching how sausage is made. If you saw it, you wouldn't want to eat it anymore. It's something like that. We get to watch all the different factions engage with the United States government in a variety of ways and formats to mold and shape U.S. foreign policy with respect to human rights. And students come to understand the enormous complexity of that process and why things take a long time and why it's not easy, why you have to have persistence throughout the whole process and not give up. So it's a phenomenal experience. The students have their own research topics. They're peppering the speakers with their own individual questions. They gather all that information and they come back, and then they have the rest of the quarter essentially on their own to write and think and continue to do research on their topic. They produce phenomenally good papers on subjects that really matter, because this has to do, of course, with human suffering and human dignity. And so these are very serious papers. And I'm very proud of the students who go on this trip and the kinds of work they come back and get involved in. So I think it's one of, if not the most successful sort of experience a student could have at the University of Washington, Bothell. Many of the students, after they experience the Washington, D.C. trip, they go into advocacy work. A high percentage of them go into law school. It really is a quite significant percentage. Out of those 25 students, it is not uncommon to have 5 to 7 go into law school. And they really kind of start to see how important that particular element in human rights work can be. Many of them join local governments here, join nonprofit organizations working for human rights causes here in the Northwest. Some of them go into their own other kinds of private businesses, but they're always carrying with them these experiences of now knowing how government actually works. And they have, I think, a newfound maturity as citizens at the local level, working for issues that transcend the local level. So that's another element of this that I think provides a next step for them in their career or education. If I had 3 wishes, if I had a genie pop up and give me my 3 wishes, what would it be? Well, one of the things would be that we could develop a robust and productive human rights center at the University of Washington that can really support students in this work. That would be certainly one of the top priorities. That would allow students to really explore and expand, to do study abroad, to work on these issues in great depth. So that would be my first wish on that list. Second would be that we see local governments start to take on human rights as a way to enhance social justice in their local communities, so that this is no longer just an external, international, something that happens back in D.C., but rather that it happens everywhere in everybody's lives all the time. And of course, the third thing, and maybe the most important, would be that we have an actual reduction in the suffering that's going on around the world. The recent recession has meant enormous growth in starvation and hunger around the world, and we really need to do a better job of distributing the world's goods to all, certainly at least a minimum that gives them a chance at a life worth a life that is worthy of dignity. So that's really the fundamental goal of all of this stuff. It isn't creating programs or centers or classes. It's really finding ways that we can reduce the suffering that's going on out there. And some of it is just getting people to consciousness about it, because we don't see what's going on everywhere. But that's really the ultimate goal that we're headed toward. And so I hope the work that we do here at the University of Washington contributes in some small measure to that actually happening, both abroad and locally as well.
For more information about research in action at University of Washington Bothell, please visit www.uwb.edu/research or call 425-352-3636.